Hello everybody, and welcome to Authors and High Theory. I'm Mark with the Modern Existentialist, and I'll be your host today. It was Nietzsche who said that the philosopher should live true to his own philosophy. It should be obvious by now, though, that that's not a moral should. It's just strictly empirical. After all, if it is the case that a philosophy is a system of belief that one sees as representative of the truth of the world, then it would make sense for someone to live as though what he believes is correct is, well, correct. That what he believes to be truth is true. In other words, if we think that we're right, then shouldn't we just act as though we're right? At least, until proven wrong. As Sartre and Beauvoir were inseparable in life, so too are they inseparable in philosophy. They made each other. They define and complete one another. Sartrean theory is fully capable of standing on its own, but it's always felt as though it was rather arcane or obscure, at least to me. It's just hard high theory that floats along, difficult to place or ground in the world, and that grounding is what Beauvoir provides. Without her, his theory is incomplete. At first glance, Beauvoirian theory can seem almost Jungian, or something like Freudian psychoanalysis. In other words, like outdated, useless psycho-bullshit. This, however, couldn't be further from the truth, because she, too, is an existentialist. What that means is that her theory is fundamentally empirical in nature, that it's rational and logical and fully and entirely provable, and that I can literally plot it out on a graph, which, incidentally, is what we're going to do today. Beauvoir's Archetypes of Man can appear, initially, to the untrained eye, like a baseless metaphysical system which attempts to classify a bunch of different personality types into these weird, randomly arranged boxes, just completely arbitrarily. In reality, though, there's nothing that makes her method more arbitrary than just any other piece of logic or science, because it's strictly empirical. What Beauvoirian theory describes, after all, aren't personalities, not some system of traits inherent to the biology of the individual. Instead, what she lays out is a system of archetypical personal philosophies, a set of systems of thought and belief to which we can assign truth values based on our own empirical observations. In other words, Beauvoirian theory is an elegant piece of formal logic that describes, deconstructs, and places all forms of philosophy in position relative to one another, including itself. Alright, let's get into it then. Let's say that we've got a simple graph, a box chart, if you will. In this box, we have two axes. The first is the axis on which we can place what Sartre and Beauvoir describe as the serious and the absurd, or what Nietzsche describes as the Apollonian and the Dionysian, an expression of whether someone believes that meaning and value are inherent to the world, or whether they believe that meaning and value are absent from it. The second axis is where we'd place what Sartre and Beauvoir describe as agency, and what Nietzsche describes as power, an expression of whether someone believes that they either are responsible for the actions and choices that they make within the world, or if they believe that their choices don't really matter and can't ever really affect the world. Now, what we can do with Beauvoirian theory is we can take her value pair, the serious absurd axis, along with the agency axis, and we can plot them against each other inside of the box. Then we can go around in a circle, exploring the logical consequences of the extremes which exist at the edges of the box, all the different archetypes of man which she describes. In the Ethics of Ambiguity, Beauvoir lays out the archetypes of man not as a chart or a graph, but instead as a story, a linear progression or an evolution, which leads man toward the achievement of a final state of self-awareness. That is, an awareness and acknowledgement of the nature of one's own existence as both subject and object, both being and nothingness. The person who successfully achieves this state, who realizes an empirical self-awareness, is what she and Sartre together call the truly free man, and what Nietzsche refers to as the Übermensch. All men begin as children, as individuals born into a world of which they have no knowledge. In the act of growing and learning, a child can only ever acquire information which either he himself has witnessed, or which he has witnessed others telling him that they themselves have witnessed, with little reason to distrust the nature of the reality which he sees, with no reason to doubt the truth of the world which he's told is real. He's therefore inclined to believe that the world into which he's born is true, fixed, and absolute, a serious world of metaphysical objectivity, incontrovertibly real. The child is the individual who's not yet aware of his own agency, of his ability to act on reality as a subject in a world of objects. He believes himself to be an object, not an actor, but a spectator, just a function of the world itself. He hasn't yet come to the realization that the world into which he's been born isn't a metaphysical objectivity, but instead that it's a social one. What he has yet to learn is the fact that the world in which he exists hasn't always existed in a perpetual unchanging state, that the world which he inhabits is, in reality, one which is created by man, by other subjects, the adults of the world, and that he, as a subject himself, is therefore also equally capable of and responsible for any change that he will effect upon it. The child is the individual who believes his experience to be objective, and so presents and acts within the world as though he were an object, not inherently or innately, but instead because he believes us when we've told him that it is so. As children learn and grow, they gradually become more and more aware of the nature of man as a subject. They realize that, at least to some degree, the world which they inhabit is one which is created and defined by man, by adults. They begin to internalize the idea that, one day, they will grow up too, to become adults and full agents who will be equally as capable of and responsible for any actions which they make in the world. At a certain point in his life, the child becomes aware that he either is already or will someday become a full and equal agent. Some children react to this discovery with joy, longing for the power to define the world and to become the fully free agents which they believe that adults are. Others react with terror and anguish in the most Sartrean of senses, fearing and dreading the discomfort and responsibility which is implicit in becoming man, in becoming an agent with no choice but to choose. And so the child finds himself at a crossroads, at a choice which he must make, at a fork in the binary logic of the potential to either be or not be an agent, because, well, what other option could there be? The child must choose here to become either one of two things, the subman or the serious man. The subman is the individual who's become aware of his own agency, but then chooses to deny that he is an agent. Fearing and rejecting the responsibility of agency, the subman flees from adulthood. In his search for complacency, he chooses to attempt to return to a state of existence which is almost childlike in its nature. a state in which it's possible for him to imagine himself incapable of acting on or defining the world. A state in which he makes it possible for himself to deny that he's responsible for anything at all, for any of the choices which he chooses to or not to make. He'll choose instead to claim that he never had a choice, or that the choices were never his to make, that everything is and should be someone else's responsibility. The subman is the individual who Nietzsche calls the slave, the one who chooses to believe that his inaction and passivity represent a cardinal virtue. He calls himself humble and innocent and believes that, because he's never done any wrong, he must therefore be right and good. The subman is the one who believes that good is, itself, an uncorrupted inherent essence, the absence of evil in some kind of metaphysical incorporeal soul, and not instead the action of doing good, which is made within the world. The serious man, on the other hand, is the individual who's become aware of his agency, but, rather than feeling anguish and then choosing to deny it, he chooses instead to acknowledge it. Reveling in the idea of becoming a free agent, an adult with the power to act upon and define the world for himself, the serious man is Nietzsche's dogmatist, someone who believes that the actions which he takes and the world he creates are themselves serious constructs, that the things which he decides and which he creates become constructs of an absolute, incontrovertible, metaphysically objective reality. Raised to believe in the absolute truth of the serious world which he inhabits, the serious man believes that, as an adult, he has earned the right to participate in some grand, serious project, to help create and define the world which lends his existence inherent metaphysical meaning. Thus, the serious man looks upon the world, at the subman and the child, and then back at himself, and then chooses to believe himself and all others like him, all the other adults who have chosen to invest into his same seriousness, to be themselves the pinnacle of human enlightenment. He believes himself better than all the rest, inherently and essentially. The subman and the serious man, as representations of archetypical philosophies, both look at themselves and see themselves to be valid representations of truth. The subman's logic, however, quickly reveals itself as immediately empirically wrong, because he denies his own agency, his responsibility for his own choices, and instead chooses to believe wholeheartedly in the truth which he's been told, in the serious world, which is innate and inherent, and in which he is powerless to act. The serious man's logic finds itself also immediately flawed. Though he acknowledges and embraces his agency as a function of his subjectivity, he fails to realize that his subjectivity is actually a subjectivity at all. He believes that his opinions, the things which he thinks that he knows and believes, can actually be confirmed to an absolute degree of metaphysically objective certainty. And so, we can see that he, too, must be empirically wrong. After all, as existentialists, we know that we can only ever know anything to the best of our ability. And so, like the child, the serious man still believes his experience to be objective. However, unlike the child, the serious man presents and acts within the world as though he were a subject. The series continues in the next episode, where we'll be discussing the other side of the box, the absurd world, and again revisiting the topic of nihilist absurdist theory. Stay tuned, and for now, this is Mark, signing off. Catch you guys on the next one.